The Pacers get a blowout win over the New York Knicks. They lead by as many as 43 points. They led by 20 points at the end of the first quarter, and they hold the Knicks to a defensive rating of 92.7 points per 100 possessions, which is their best defensive rating of the playoffs, their second best defensive rating of the entire season. And also, the Knicks did not score 50 points until there was 6 minutes to go in the third quarter. What do you think led to the fast start? And then we'll probably get into how much of this do you think was about the Pacers versus how much of this was about the Knicks?
JJ was on the call, and he was kind of foreshadowing what, with subjective validation, can seem like prescience, perhaps. Right in the first couple minutes of the game, he's saying, well, the Knicks, they've been injured. They've been playing their guys what seems like an unsustainable amount of basketball. Can they keep this up? What we've talked about, is there a point of diminishing returns here? And I think that also mixed with the fact that the Pacers have been able to muster up good defense every once in a while throughout the playoffs. And shot making is not always there for the Pacers, but it will come around in a game or two at a time. I think all those things calcified into one game. And that's how every time you looked at the box score, if you were looking at that or watching the game, you're like, they're by 40 points? How the hell did this happen in a series that was always like wire to wire? Super fun game for Pacers fans. Probably not that much fun for playoff fans, and probably horrible for Knicks fans.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent, it looked like the Knicks were put together with paper clips and glue throughout most of the first quarter. And for the first time, the Pacers, I felt thoroughly were the team that was quicker to the ball and with the ball, not only just starting the game with Nembhard making the no dribble drive all the way to the rim, some of what TJ did as soon as he came back into the game. I mean, you and I had talked about it on the prior show about, will they get a combination performance from the starters and from TJ and Obi providing electricity? And they definitely did, because as soon as those two entered the game, the Pacers were already up 10-4, but they went on a 24-10 run. And the very first thing TJ does is it's like, oh, I'm chasing over a screen against Brunson. I'm going to late switch. And then he steals that pocket pass. It ends up being a steal and assist going the other way. And like that just stood out a lot in contrast to what the Knicks are doing, because there was even a play where TJ got completely wrecked by a screen, fell down. The Knicks had a 5-on-4 advantage. And instead of Brunson trying to press and force the defense to commit, he took like a pretty quick pull-up transition three that was semi-contested. And that just kind of seemed like the difference in approach, in addition to, the Pacers getting some offensive rebounds. Maybe a little bit of luckiness where, that Knicks actually showed decent efforts a few times on the same possession, and Miles throws in a really late clock three, literally almost looks like he's throwing it in versus shooting it. So the Knicks definitely did shoot 7 of 37 from three overall in the game, and that contributed. But at halftime, the Pacers weren't too far off for having more points in the paint than the Knicks had actual points. So
I've been lucky in my needs to play worse, needs to play better. The Nesmith thing we talked about at the end of the Bucks series, I was like, you can concoct a lot of different ways for things to look, but sometimes shots need to go in. We got the Nesmith game we needed there. DiVincenzo, who has been one of the most accomplished three-point shooters in the NBA this season, talked about how, yes, he is a very good shooter, but the difficulty and volume that he was providing, along with the efficiency, I didn't think was necessarily something he could maintain. Like that is like, it could be a plateau 35, 38 points range, but I don't know if it'll stay there. Got the tough shooting performance from him that was maybe necessary. A little bit of regression. Doesn't mean he could come back next game and the next 3 games and pop the hell off, of course. But yeah, the stuff that these linchpin performances that the Pacers have needed have come both in the good version and the bad version, I suppose.
I do want to talk a little bit of the defense and what you just said there, because there was changes against DiVincenzo. From the very tip, they altered those matchups. So in the prior game, in case people don't remember, they had put Nesmith on Jalen Brunson. They had put Andrew Nembhard on Josh Hart to kind of play that roamer role. And they had put Tyrese Haliburton on Donte DiVincenzo. And we talked fairly extensively about, like, what are you going to do with Tyrese guarding Donte DiVincenzo? You probably need to alter this. As it turns out, they didn't change the coverage. They just changed who was guarding him. So they put Nembhard on Donte DiVincenzo, put Tyrese back on Josh Hart. And then the big difference to me, which I wrote the article about Aaron Nesmith and also the village that is guarding Jalen Brunson, is something else we talked about at the end of the podcast. The Pacers had a designated roamer, and it was who was ever guarding the 4. So Pascal Siakam playing very far off from Precious Achiuwa. That extended not only to Pascal, but also to Obi Toppin. They were doing this no matter who was at the 4. If it was Josh Hart at the 4 and they were playing smaller, the roamer was roaming. If they were I even saw a couple of possessions of them doing this against Alec Burks in the third quarter.
Mm-hmm.
So just to show a little bit of film on this and what the effect of it was. These were some of the possessions that we talked about just to give like a before and after effect from the games that were in New York, where the two of us were like, this is a very toothless dig from Pascal Siakam. You're not getting Jalen Brunson off balance, and you're also not staying within arm's reach of Josh Hart in case he does, a cut behind that type of a stunt. Now look at Pascal. This is not Jalen Brunson, but when Tyrese, falls for the shot fake and is up in the air, Pascal's fully committing to a jump switch, and that's Precious Achiuwa clear above the break, coming all the way off, and then Josh Hart trying to create separation for that pull-up too. Another one we talked about in the prior game, Game 3, where I was like, this is somewhat confusing. Tyrese is guarding Donte DiVincenzo, but he's rotating over as the low man to guard Jalen Brunson, and Pascal's just kind of in no man's land, neither taking away the cut from Achiuwa or having any impact as a secondary rim protector, and then ended up getting that foul. Now look at the difference last night, where Nembhard's guarding DiVincenzo, but it is Pascal who's going over to be able to impact that drive. He actually makes contact on the tag to let Nesmith get back in front of what that was, that late switch, and then Nembhard jumps back out to guard DiVincenzo. And I felt like Pascal was very attentive with his box outs in this game, where he was actually spotting and looking for guys and sometimes even putting people close to the stanchion under the basket in order for guys to get rebounds. And that's a lot different from what we had seen in the prior game, where he totally missed that one against Donte DiVincenzo in the corner, giving them extra points. So I felt like overall, Pascal's defense was a pretty big difference maker, because there he is helping off from the ball side corner. He was constantly lurking behind drives. So it's like, yeah, Aaron Nesmith's defending with a lot of tenacity, a lot of length to contest against Jalen Brunson, but they almost always had a shadow in the strong side paint, sometimes to extreme levels. Like, look what Pascal's doing here against Josh Hart.
Mm-hmm.
Clear flooded over to the strong side block, which, yeah, that makes for a longer closeout. And I felt at times that's a short closeout, which is what you want. There were times where they were a little bit undisciplined with the closeout. I will throw this one in here first. There is a give and take to this. As you pointed out in the last podcast, Precious was an explosive cutter a few times on some of these possessions. Something you can do with somebody who's not necessarily a floor spacer from the corner is an uphill handoff. He then gets loose on a roll possession from that because of Pascal had been sagging off and then nobody tagged it. But then some of the closeouts that I mentioned, like this one from Pascal, he gets caught up in the air. You don't need to close that hard against Josh Hart if this is going to be the coverage. And then likewise, when TJ gets kind of caught going over the screen, you can see Pascal collapsing off the 4-man again. Ben Shepherd makes the correct rotation, and Pascal then closes out hard again, and that's Donte DiVincenzo. But in that case, you would actually want TJ to peel if Pascal is going to come that far off. So just a lot of clips to show that, again, clear over at the nail off of that from Josh Hart, and then he chops his feet to actually use the shorter closeout and gets Josh to shoot the 3 instead of getting into the lane. So to a certain extent, I doubt it's going to be a popular choice, but Pascal was actually my standout performer from this game, because by my eye, this was the best, perhaps all-around defensive performance that I've seen from him since he's been with the Pacers, especially in this type of a role.
Yeah, so something that Pascal has dealt with in the past couple of years is he was kind of like a Nick in some sense. There was the one season where he led the NBA in miles traveled, in isolations, and in closeouts, and in minutes per game. And over a 2-year span of basketball, he had played the most minutes. Basically, like the Nick Nurse House of Madness he was featured prominently in it. And he also sustained quite a few different injuries. His athleticism is not where it was when he was like 26, 27. However, the type of defense we're seeing here, where he's cheating to the strong side, despite having these weak side responsibilities, that was his claim to fame. That was something he did a lot on the run up to a championship. That was what he did in his best defensive years, was cheating and recovering and playing and mucking up a lot of strong side stuff without foregoing anything on the weak side. He gives up more on the weak side than he used to, but this is a familiar role for him to step into. And it's nice to see, because you and we've been lamenting some of Siakam's defense and doing it quite often, to see him kind of find himself in a familiar role and dedicate to it and have a good defensive outcome because of that. Nice to see in this game. Hopefully something, depending on how they play matchups going forward, hopefully something that we can see going forward as well.
Yeah, because just really quick, Obi Toppin doing this as well, where he's all the way off, providing, an actually stationary door at the nail, unlike what we had seen from Tyrese in games 1 and 2, where a few times when Jalen started to penetrate, he would actually leap back towards Josh Hart. When we were talking about some of the, aggressive passiveness with some of the stunts that were going on. And then you could see him like, this is Alec Burks, and he's all the way flooded over to that block to provide Jalen Brunson and having to make that read out to the corner, and then he recovers. Like, some of these still led to points, but I felt overall, like, when we're talking about what adjustments the Pacers made, they've made quite a few defensively, not only just putting Aaron Nesmith and making that change, because I do have some numbers for the last 2 games with Aaron Nesmith as Jalen Brunson's primary. Jalen Brunson scored 33.8 points per 100 matchups against Nesmith compared to what had been the games against Nembhard, 48.3 points per 100 matchups. And just to point out, too, that when you go back to February, I looked at the game because I was interested when Nesmith fouled out against Jalen Brunson on February 1st. That number was 50. It was 50 points per 100 matchups, and they were not doing this defensive scheme. And what had stood out to me in game 3 was, like, when we were talking about that pick 6 from Tyrese Haliburton, Nembhard had peeled off of Josh Hart to plug that drive, and that allowed Tyrese to be more aggressive on the backside. In a way, what they're doing with these coverages is allowing Aaron to be more aggressive on the ball, and it's allowing people to play aerial ace more aggressively because they're erecting that wall from this extra player coming over. So I ask you, because you're going to be more familiar with this than me, I don't know what OG Anunoby's status is going to be for the rest of this series, but based on what you're seeing from this scheme change and what I just showed you, if he's back in at the 4, how do you think that affects things both for the Knicks and for the Pacers?
It affects everything pretty heavily.
Yeah.
Some of this, we saw it in game 2. A lot of his drives against certain types of closeouts, it was a much better driving game than I think you can reasonably expect from OG. But seeing that kind of stuff pop off, it looms in the mind of the defense. Once you've seen it once in a playoff series, it's hard to kind of shake loose of that. Also, just shooting is there, especially if he's in the corner. He's led the NBA in corner shots. He's been like a very high volume player from there, on good percentages as well. And defensively, he plugs holes, just quite frankly. Mm-hmm. In how I just talked about how Pascal used to be able to muck up the strong side actions without giving up anything on the weak side. That isn't who Pascal is anymore, but that's who OG is when he's on the floor now. And still, the ripple effects would be very, very wide. I think the Pacers still have a shot in this series if OG is back and fully healthy. Don't get me wrong, but they have to figure out a couple different things. And it might be, we started talking about the Donte DiVincenzo thing. You could see there was 3 attempted threes that he had last night where you could see Nembhard is on the chase, and it was a missed shot. It wasn't a repeat of game 3 where DiVincenzo is taking a handoff, escape dribble into space off the line, bombing threes with Nembhard and chase. It didn't necessarily manifest that way, but you might have to go back to somebody like Tyrese on DiVincenzo if OG is back in the lineup. I don't know if they do that, but that might be something that you have to once again, okay, we're probably losing something here. We're not gaining much by switching to have to occupy OG offensively. And defensively, yeah, wide-ranging ripple effect. That's OG. I don't know if it's still the case, but all of his minutes that he's played with the New York Knicks, he's never been a negative in a game. Maybe there's 1 or 2 playoff games this year, but they win with him on the floor for a reason. If he's back, it's a really big deal.
And I would point out what you just said there about, you might have to go back to Tyrese on Donte DiVincenzo. They, in theory, could still play him on Josh Hart, leave Nembhard on DiVincenzo, leave Nesmith on Brunson. Pascal would have to guard OG in that situation. I don't know. Tyrese, like I said, can play aerial ace. He can roam and stick his arms in passing lanes. It's not going to have the same threatening effect with Tyrese pulling over as the passive size that Siakam and Obi Toppin are going to be able to provide. So then it brings to question, he's not going to be able to do that roamer role as well. So maybe if you think that Donte DiVincenzo was shooting over his head to a degree in game 3, maybe you're like, well, we will just put Tyrese back on Donte DiVincenzo so that Nembhard can be doing more of the roaming from Josh Hart. But another option, just something that hopefully Benji's not mad that I'm revealing because he had asked me before the series started and I want to get your opinion of it, is he asked, would you guard OG Anunoby with Tyrese Haliburton? So in this case, you would put Siakam on Josh Hart, let him continue to do what he did in this game with his more size and going back to a role that he was once very successful at. And then I think that the bet here would be, when I talked to Benji about it and what our thought process was, is OG's the least likely screener. He's the least likely person to be somewhat involved. And maybe it's somewhat a win if he's posting up more and doing more off the dribble. But what is your thought of that?
That's funky. I kind of like it. I've watched a lot of OG Anunoby in my life.
Mm-hmm.
His forays into more meaningful read and react type of responsibilities were not entirely successful. And they're a lot less successful against a principled defense that sets up behind a guy. Now, if the Pacers are still going to be able to maintain that passive help, then I think you can get away with it. I'm going to be honest with you. Dedicating time to OG Anunoby post-ups, I've seen a lot of that in my life. It's not necessarily something you want to be doing. It's fine if you're beating up on a mismatch, quick thing, hit ahead in a playoff game, sure. But if that's like if they're spending 26 minutes of the game looking at that matchup, I actually think
it's interesting, right?
I might actually, that's the Samson Folk stamp of approval. I would try that.
I think it's interesting because I knew that you would know more about his overall post-up game, and certainly he did post up at times for the Raptors. You and I talked about that and their wings and the value of passing out of the post. And Tyrese, to be fair, doesn't hold up against post mismatches very well at all. They might have to consider doubling in some of those situations just so he's not taking the brunt of it, given what his overall getting banged up throughout the playoffs.
I'll just say quickly, like the most common outcome for OG is if he's on Tyrese, he's going to get all the way to the rim, or if you have that help behind it,
right?
OG will be spinning into middle or baseline and looking for a shovel pass to a cutter, or like leaning out and bouncing it to the corner. And I think you really can live with that outlet to the corner. Just make sure that everybody is keyed in on those, like whether it's a 45 from the opposite side or a gut cut, something like that, or Hartenstein with that little C to the front of the rim. Just be mindful of that. But OG, if you make him pick up his dribble, like his footwork, he can get himself into trouble, and he's looking to make like one or two reads. It can be pretty linear in there. So I think that there are definitely ways for them to win, even if Tyrese cedes ground to a lower pickup point.
Right, because I mean, the 4 for the Pacers is collapsing in every scenario in this past game. I felt like that was a huge difference to their scheme from what we had seen in the prior 3. And also, so what if you're in your opinion, they were like, well, let's counter this by using, like I said, he's a less likely screener, but what if they're like, let's counter this by just putting Tyrese into action and having OG go screen for Jalen Brunson?
I think they can score that way. OG is not used that often, but I think he's a capable roller.
Okay.
And I also think like it depends if he's attacking straight on, especially if they're running like an above the break screen. OG can like pump and put the ball down. There's like 3 different spots on the court he can make a pass to. He can make whether it's the shovel to the dunker spot or a bounce pass to the dunker spot. He can go to either corner. There's plays that he can make there. You could end up getting into that OG Anunoby like stop pop fader that he doesn't make very often. But some of that is decision making for OG that he doesn't have to make very often. But from what I've seen in the past, there's different things he can do from that spot, but it depends.
When you watch the Knicks during a regular season game, and there's not this much game planning going into it and this much exaggerated coverage, they're a lot more apt to have Josh Hart be the screener and be getting downhill out of those actions. Kind of similar to what I saw Andrew Nembhard do last night. I really liked the possession where he was a roll man and pinged it out to Obi Toppin in the corner. But
players who can do it all are so cool. Nembhard being that guy, starring his role, maybe shot making gets to a point where it's not so much in his role anymore in his future. I'm just saying I like the guy.
While we're talking about former Raptors, I also want to talk about Pascal on the other side of the ball, continuing to be guarded by Josh Hart, where he's backdoor cutting against Josh Hart and getting to the rim. They were isolating him quite a bit against the elbow and some of these clear outs that we talked about on the prior episode, where he's just getting all the way to the basket using spin moves to get around Josh Hart. The Knicks still aren't really sending double teams there. And I just wanted to know from you, because this is something that I didn't bring up on the prior podcast, and we probably should have talked about it a little bit, is that at the end of game 3, with about 5 minutes to go, Josh Hart picked up that offensive foul with Nembhard drawing the charge. He was in foul trouble. So Thibodeau made the adjustment to put Isaiah Hartenstein on Pascal Siakam, and then they were putting Josh Hart on Miles Turner. I actually did think that impacted the offense a little bit. We talked off air about the one short roll pass that Pascal had missed to the corner, although he did make a couple others, and Nembhard didn't make those threes. But the Pacers tend to lean on, they're going to put the opposing 5 into the screening action. So that meant that Pascal was a lot more often used as the roller. And then, like, this possession, I don't really know why Miles didn't think that he could shoot over the top of a closeout from Jalen Brunson, but then it gets reversed, and now it's going to be another screen from Pascal Siakam, and he doesn't get out of those picks quite as quickly to be able to pop to the free throw line area as what Miles does to be able to hit those shots. So
Yeah.
I guess my long extended question here is, were you at all surprised, or do you think that the Knicks might go back to playing Hartenstein on Siakam based on what we saw at the very end of that third quarter and the fact that they didn't really do it in game 4?
Well, can I flip this back to you?
Sure.
Based on what you've seen, do you think the Knicks are? Do you think they care more so about putting Hartenstein, or do you think that the Siakam coverage that they want is more related to Siakam being in a good spot, or do you think it's more so about wanting to affect how the possessions look for the Pacers?
As far as the idea that they might be thinking, hey, we know that we're giving up a mismatch with Josh Hart on Pascal, but those possessions might take a little bit longer than what would be the case if Tyrese is doing more of the initiating and they're getting into their flow game with the pick and roll, potentially, because maybe they feel like they'll be able to load up more if that's what they're giving up. But I mean, there's a few times in this game where they did send an extra body. Like Obi Toppin did make a 3 where Pascal got it at the top of the key, somewhat semi-transition. He drew the extra help, and then Obi made a 3 off of that. But for the most part, when he has his back to the basket, they're not often sending doubles in those situations, which, as we had talked about in the preview, they weren't very good at sending doubles against Joel Embiid, against the Philadelphia 76ers. So I somewhat understand that. But
Well, Deuce, like on that banker he hit over Josh Hart, like Deuce flashed there so they didn't have the spin, and Pascal had to audible out of the spin into that jumper. But I wonder, like, if they mess around with it, because Pascal is not Joel Embiid, and Pascal actually watching some of these post ups is a little bit out of practice, I think, in his reads compared to what I was seeing with the Raptors. And like, to that point, he was the hub of an offense where so much of what they did was him making reads against doubles. He was one of the most doubled players of last season and before he got traded to the Pacers. He looks a little bit out of practice. If I were the Knicks, I might play around with that a little bit, show him a few different things. But I don't know. I think Pascal, his decision-making wasn't perfect down the stretch of game 3. It seemed to me, though, that the Knicks were giving up a lot. Like they were playing behind the 8 ball when they switched that Hartenstein onto Siakam, which, egg on my face we talked about in the preview. I was like, oh, I might do something like that. But I think Tyrese is so good at creating those angles, and Pascal and Tyrese actually do have to figure out a little bit more of their synergy, because Pascal hangs that screen longer because, the one that Tyrese got the turnover on, because I think he is envisioning Tyrese being able to get lower on Hartenstein or snake. I think he was probably expecting Tyrese to snake. So he sticks the screen longer instead of slipping out or making no contact like we've seen so often. But Tyrese is so good at creating those angles for the short roll, feeding it in stride. Hartenstein can't take it away. He had trouble taking anything away when he was putting those actions. So if I were the Knicks, I probably try and play around with the mismatch, because Josh is really strong. Some of those shots that Pascal hit, like the 2 fallaways, the banker, and the one where I think he got fouled, but he put it up anyway, no call. Pretty good defense. You'd live with that. I think I try and play around with the mismatch adjacent stuff more than guarding Pascal with a 5. And credit to Pascal, because just because you don't shoot the ball well, every playoff series becomes a proving ground for you and what defenses are going to try to do. Good responses from him to be proactive with his motion to like make those tough.
Yeah, because to me, the other option, depending upon, again, if OG Anunoby's healthy and to what degree he's moving, is that you could throw him on Miles Turner almost effectively as a pre-switch, so then he is switching out to the ball. Because I know we had talked about, I was like, I don't know if OG can really apply full court pressure against Tyrese and do some of the face guarding, but in those situations, from what we've seen, although I do think that Tyrese has been better at driving some of these switches in the last 2 games than he's been throughout the entirety of these playoffs, if you could have OG switching out there, I don't know. That's something that I would probably give some consideration to just based on what we saw. But I do agree with you too that I think that Pascal did end up making some of the right reads against the Knicks coverage. It just didn't necessarily draw the attention because the shooters for the Pacers weren't making the shots down the stretch late. So I guess the next thing that I want to ask, given that the Knicks continued to play their guys in a bowl, like in the back of my head when I was watching this, I was like, if this starts to get a little bit artificially close, it might play somewhat in the Pacers' favor because Tibbs will likely keep playing these guys. As it turns out, he kept playing those guys even though it wasn't getting close. So when I'm watching some of these possessions and just like the overall difference in hustle that you're seeing on some of these possessions where like the ball ends up getting loose on these multiple drives from the Pacers where they're touching the paint. And you can see that it's actually going to bounce here, I think. And TJ still ends up getting to the ball quicker than both Josh Hart and Jalen Brunson. Like you could see this very early, like Miles being able to get that tap out. Like Miles was getting offensive rebounds over the top of Isaiah. Like here they're applying full court pressure with all 5 people. Like Miles Turner's picking up full court and they get an 8-second count. Like I don't even know if I've seen the Pacers get an 8-second violation this season. And then just seeing them also just be pushing the ball up. And this is what I said. Like, I wasn't necessarily seeing Miles get those types of offensive rebounds over Hartenstein, rather during the regular season or so far in this playoff stretch. And it just seems like, for the most part, the Pacers were a lot quicker to the ball and with the ball. Like I said, just giving up those types of plays. Now Isaiah Jackson's getting a fairly easy putback, doing to the Knicks what the Knicks do to them. Pascal going the full length of the floor for a layup. And then even the plays that I had pointed out where the Pacers always in the quarters with these 1-4 flat possessions. And I'm like, this is the most predictable play in Pacers basketball because everybody knows that the player at the right block is going to go screen for TJ. TJ double clutches and doesn't make that shot, but then you're like seeing Ben Shepherd track it down and transition and be able to get that block, which that might have had some contact too. But also in the third quarter, they're up big by 30 and you're seeing Tyrese still chase down loose balls and save them before they go over half court. Like it was just fairly palpable that the Pacers were definitely the fresher team, given that this was a matinee game on the Sunday, than what the Knicks were. So I guess like I think that the change in the defensive scheme definitely made a difference. Of course, it certainly helped that the Knicks didn't shoot the ball well, but also where do you come down when you're seeing this? And it's definitely a flip-flop of what we've seen, that the Pacers, like I said, have the fresh legs, and the Knicks look like they're on their last leg for a lot of those possessions.
Yeah, it's people talked about it, and I don't think people like talking about it. I don't like talking about it until it becomes proven, because I think you sound kind of like, well, I feel like I sound like a jackass when I'm like, well, they're going to get tired. The game is about effort. It's like, well, we can talk about more specific things than that, but human beings out on a court. And while some guys on the Knicks clearly are built a little bit different, like they are more accustomed to these high minute, high impact, types of games, we still have a decent amount of history of expected, stamina, effort, ability to go the extra mile from a lot of NBA players over time. These Knicks, some of these guys are like, Josh Hart is almost in unprecedented territory here. DiVincenzo plays a lot. Brunson plays a lot. And I think you should expect there to be diminishing returns, especially as they lose other guys to help like be a ballast for that. It's not altogether surprising, but I guess it is good for the Pacers that we've reached the point in the series where you can like talk about this, like, okay, depth mattered and it's going to continue to matter. Also, Tyrese shooting like 43% from the field and 30% from three over his first 6-7 games, and now over the past 55% from the field, 46% from three. It makes the Knicks spend more time running on offense. It allows him to be more of a focal point and speeding up the Pacers offense. It makes these guys do more miles traveled, this kind of stuff, and it still has the efficiency paired with it. I think this kind of stuff is starting to marry into one another, and then now it's on the Knicks, It's not on the Pacers anymore.
It was almost some of me wondering how much of this was an outlier due to extraordinary circumstances, because Brunson, to me, doesn't look like he's had the same lift since he had the foot injury. He wasn't listed as questionable before this game, but then there was the play where I don't know that Nesmith necessarily intentionally stepped under Jalen Brunson, but he was in his landing area. Brunson does come down somewhat awkwardly, albeit on the other foot. And as I said, this was a matinee game, so I don't know if you can expect the same difference in the level of fatigue and the next game is what favored the Pacers in this one, because they are used to playing at this pace. They are used to playing more guys in a way that the Knicks aren't. But to your point about Tyrese and what attention he's seeing, and just as another before and after, shout out to Aaron Nesmith, who when Tyrese sees extra attention, actually punches the gap and it tries to drive to the rim so that I don't have to show clips of Josh Hart anymore and being like, why can't anybody from the Pacers make these types of plays when Tyrese is seeing that coverage? So that's my self-indulgent throwing in of clips. But I guess my last thing that I really thought about this game, and I don't know, did you manage to stay through until the very end, or did you tune out?
I watched it afterwards because I was missing the game anyway, and I wasn't writing for it. So after we did the lottery live stream, we went to the climbing gym. And so I kept looking at my phone and being like, I think it was 34-11. I was like, it's 34-11? That's crazy. And then they were winning by 40 the next time I checked. And I was like, what the hell? And then I got home later that night and I watched it. And I was like, oh, this all makes so much sense to me. But I was kind of just popping in on the box score. And I was like, this seems like such a crazy game. But
the reason I ask is because to a certain extent, the last three quarters were all garbage time. But by the end of the game, Jarace Walker did get to play. So another reason why yes. And the reason why I'm asking you this is because I think that there is somewhat of another Raptors connection. Not because I do not think that Scotty Barnes and Jarace Walker move remotely similar as players. Jarace's physicality does not match his physique a lot of the time, especially by comparison to the physical force that Scotty Barnes can be. That being said, Jarace does have a very unique skill set in that you can imagine both of these players doing a lot of different things. They're very toolsy. So I just kind of wanted to get your impression of Point Jarace down the stretch, with the caveat that he was in a lineup with Kendall Brown, Jalen Smith, Isaiah Jackson, and Doug McDermott, which is like going to be a good trivia question somewhere down the road, I'm pretty confident. But what did you think of Jarace? I'm sure that people would like to know your opinion of this, or if you noticed anything about him.
So in the comparison to Scotty, which I know you're not really making a comparison, just two guys next to each other, the really cool thing about Scotty is even if Scotty underwhelms, he will let you know that he underwhelms, because Scotty is so good for people who are interested in development, because he'll leave nothing on the table, really. He'll try it. You'll see if he's good at something. He will repeatedly try something, even if he's terrible at it. He'll just I'm out here and I'm doing it. And as you said, Scotty will pit his physicality up against anybody. The first, Jarace hit his first playoff bucket. It was a 21-foot jumper, right? Scotty's first was a bully drive, Tyrese Maxey out of the corner to the middle of the court where Joel Embiid stepped up and he dunked over him. There's two really big differences in approach. But as far as skill set, Jarace is really interesting. And I even think some of these plays that we see Pascal in, where it's short rolling, making reads out of it, getting middle, feeling comfortable in the middle, relying on shot making in the middle, just being that hub in motion, which is the biggest part of being a short roll god. Jarace, I think so much of that is interesting. As far as Point Jarace, I don't know. There's always meat on the bone for talented NBA players that you can try and mine. Like even Kyle Anderson at this point, right? There's unique aspects of the game that you can go for. I remember somebody wrote a piece about Kyle Anderson's unique playmaking and Jonas Valanciunas making a cut way back in the Memphis Grizzlies days, although that writer isn't coming to mind right now. You can always mine good players, good big players for their unique playmaking. As far as just like Point Jarace, so much remains to be seen. But like the Pacers, there's no reason for them to rule anything out just now. But yeah, I don't know. Interesting, fun.
And that's what's interesting about him, right? Because I like that you point out the short roll stuff and being able to make plays in motion, because the video doesn't exist anymore. But last draft cycle, Adam Spinella and I recorded a podcast about Taylor Hendricks and Jarace Walker, and the numbers on Jarace, he's very floater dependent. He doesn't get to the rim often. Last year when he was at Houston, he almost attempted more shots as runners than he did at the rim. And those numbers were similar to that in the half court with the Mad Ants this year. The Pacers, like I said, there's a funny clip of Tyrese being mic'd up in Sacramento, and he's like making fun of Lloyd Pierce, poking at him and being like, Lloyd just told Jarace to attack the rim with violence. But it's true. Like, you don't often see Jarace do that. But in a lot of these games, you don't get to see him do some of the things that did show up at Houston in small doses, where it's like he's a canny short roll passer. Like, he makes very good reads, and not just like I'm catching it and automatically turning and throwing it to the opposite corner and making that predetermined assumption that that's where the low man's going to come. There's some manipulation there.
He can bait a stunt, totally.
Yeah, and he can pass people open a little bit, and also he has a very effective keeper. And that helps him to turn the ball downhill. And like, that was one of the few times at Houston where he actually got to the rim from outside the 3-point line, because that opens up a wider lane for him. But like in a lineup like last night, obviously he kind of needed to play quote unquote point guard, because the only other guard on the floor was Doug McDermott. But you wouldn't know this, because I'm sure, I don't know if you watched any Mad Ants games this year. Probably not.
Zero.
Yeah, probably not. But like, he does a lot of the point guarding for the Mad Ants as well. And sometimes this has been somewhat, this is why I wanted to ask with regards to Scotty, because sometimes this has been a point of confusion for me, and perhaps more so within the context of the Pacers offense, because I often find myself asking, when would he do that if he was a regular rotation player? Like, when would Rick Carlisle be like, let's have Jarace do more of the ball handling in the half court rather than TJ McConnell, or rather than Tyrese Haliburton, or rather than Andrew Nembhard? And that's where the development question comes into, because I agree with you. I don't think they have to know what he is or how they want to use him yet, because he does have a lot of interesting things that can pop off at times. But I'm still not necessarily sure that I envision him in that way, except for maybe more so in the sense of like wing initiation, where last night he did have the really good play where he got a screen, used a hostage dribble, got his guy on the back, and then instead of shooting the floater, threw the lob to Isaiah Jackson over the top with his offhand. Like, he can do some of that stuff, but like, we've talked about it. I don't think either one of us necessarily liked the terminology of point Scotty anyways, because there is a delineation in what bigs or wings do versus what guards are doing when they're initiating. But I didn't know if you could speak to that at all, just based on the little bit of Jarace that you've probably seen.
Yeah, this is where sometimes you and I have to, like, you just submit to yourself to the mercy of, like, I'm not the coach. And as much as you and I, the things we talk about end up manifesting in the game, and we get to be like, nice, cool, we know some basketball. And thank you to the people who are, compliment that we get some things right. We're also not NBA coaches, and NBA coaches are the ones who have to thread the tiny needle of development versus maintenance of, a good basketball team. And I don't know if Jarace gets to do point stuff in small 2-minute packages in 17 games next year. I don't know if he gets like a little portion of the offense while he's in the rotation that they very deliberately go to. Like, for example, like the OG Anunoby, his post-ups, the scoring when he was with the Raptors, terrible. Absolutely tanked it. But the Raptors, just based on OG, what he wanted to grow his game, they felt they owed it to him to let him try. It was bad offense, but they still allowed him, the attempts. Jarace should be a big part of the Pacers going forward. I reckon next year, not always game 4 of the Eastern Conference semifinals, but next year I reckon that there'll be some plays, some packages where it's Jarace's own and he makes of it what he will, if I had to guess.
It's interesting to watch him because even like last night, a lot of times I think with rookies, you think about the game needing to slow down for them. And sometimes he thinks too fast for the game.
Yeah.
Like he processes very quickly and he thinks that he knows where a pass is going to be or where a play is going to be before it's actually manifested itself. Because like even last night he had a possession as the low man where he went over to help and he was like, well, that's supposed to be an X out. You go X out. And instead of running to the corner, he was like pointing for that person to go do it. So there's like some of that type of stuff, but like very interesting to me that somebody that you drafted number 8 overall last year came into a game after Kendall Brown, who spent most of the year on two-way contract, and after you're playing multiple centers at once, and Doug McDermott.
That's from the outside looking in. Jarace is in a really unique and weird spot, but unique and weird spots do not mean people should be lower.
Yep.
We don't see practice. This is something Patrick McCaw spellbinding for Raptors fans because there was no measurable impact he had. You could see the skill set. He didn't do much on the floor, and everybody would be like, why does the coaching staff trust this guy and love this guy? And you just have to chalk it up to like, I guess we don't see practice. Yeah. Precious Achiuwa not starting ahead of Khem Birch initially in the 2021-22 season. You just have to be like, I guess we don't see practice because that's a coach sees practice and what creates trust for a guy who hasn't played minutes for you. You have to see it in practice. Is it entirely likely that Precious Achiuwa was concocting the utmost jackassery in practice and was like, and Nick Nurse was like aghast, but then as soon as he starts on the floor, you start winning minutes because in, Vision 6-9 Democratic rim protection, he really popped out. You don't know. And Jarace hasn't gotten enough minutes for all this stuff, for the weekend push lobs and get middle, keep guys in jail. That might not manifest in practice the same way, but some guys just play better in games, And
I'm glad that you said that because I think that that's pretty effective in that what you see in garbage time and what the context of garbage time can be isn't necessarily what coaches are seeing every single day in a controlled setting to know what somebody's readiness is. But I guess I do want to know your overall opinion of Doug McDermott did play ahead of Jarace for the most part. Jarace got some chances here and there down the stretch, but it was Doug. And I can tell you from the past that when Doug played in the bubble in 4 playoff games, I believe he shot 2 of 10 from 3 against the Miami Heat. Sabonis not there, couldn't run handoff actions. The Heat are switching everything. Meanwhile, the Pacers can't really switch with him out on the floor. He's going to be hunted. Pretty similar scenario in the prior series against Boston. I think he ended up getting played off the floor. So you could probably look into the crystal ball and see that he wasn't necessarily going to have a major role in the playoffs for the Pacers. And yet, on the other hand of it, which was an argument that I made to people several times, you don't have Buddy Hield, Tyrese dealing with an injury. They desperately needed to have a movement shooter out on the floor, even for no other reason than Tyrese is having to do all of the movement shooter things. I'm watching plays out of timeouts where he's the floppy out of cutter. The cutter out of floppy, sorry, and being used as a stack screener instead of being able to do as much out of the pick and roll, like uncomfortable things that he wasn't used to having to be able to do. No longer getting ghost screens. Ben Shepherd was also dealing with strep throat for a time. I was like, I understand why they're playing Doug, given what they were missing in the aftermath of the trade deadline and how Tyrese looked hampered. And yet, if some of those minutes for Jarace had potentially gone to Jarace instead of Doug, maybe you're looking at he can be somewhat of a big contributor in the playoffs. Because I would counter too, and let me add on, that I don't think that Jarace looked ready to play minutes for the Pacers until he had played minutes with the Mad Ants and came back from being with the Mad Ants. Probably somewhat similar to, is that what you would say of Grady when he came back from playing with the Raptors in 905, that he looked more ready to be playing than prior to when he was playing for the 905?
I can't speak about ready because with Grady being like Jarace, there's a lot. Grady, there's a lot of unique stuff, but at the forefront of it, Grady doesn't have Jarace's body. He doesn't have a lot of stuff. He just has to shoot the damn thing. The change from being a 25% three-point shooter before going down to the G League and being terrible in the G League and then just coming back up, there's no process for Grady. It was just Grady just started shooting like 38% from three afterwards. And I just finished rewatching all of Grady's jumpers from the past season because nobody really tracks like movement. There's catch and shoot, there's pull up, but I wanted to know like what's he shooting on, like these DiVincenzo-esque threes, for
Right.
example. And there's a huge difference in what he shoots on his motion threes before and after. There's a huge difference on what he shoots on catch and shoot threes. And I'm noticing a couple things in the jumper. He did go through a strength training program, but as far as like process, Grady didn't have anything that is discernible. He just was better, in better shape. But when the first conversation I ever had with Grady, when like was at Summer League when he was lamenting the size of the court. He was like,
Right.
"It's big, and I run a lot." Grady runs a lot, so he got gassed. So it might just be like conditioning, but
And
I
that's a
just
big difference because
yeah.
I had pointed out with you too that like you could tell in summer league and early in the season where his use of misdirection and his ability to set up his man and how he would, physicality would bother him. He'd get pushed off his routes at times. And some of that did seem like it was a conditioning thing as much as a strength thing as well. And with Jarace, it was more so he was breaking from scheme a lot in a way that was compromising the scheme. So
Mm.
by having him go play with the Mad Ants, because the Pacers scheme, especially at the beginning of the season, as I've mentioned before, Bruce Brown being like, I've never done this before. It was vastly different from what Jarace did at Houston, which was a very aggressive trapping pre-rotation with him as the low man versus the Pacers sometimes don't even have one. Like there was a learning curve for him. So I didn't feel like he was ready to be executing some of those coverages until he had come back from playing with the Mad Ants for a number of games, but I don't
This is
know.
like
This
this.
has been a very controversial topic down the stretch that like Doug did play in front of Jarace after Doug was signed, even though Doug probably didn't have a clear path to being able to play in the playoffs and you missed out on that developmental time, but also maybe if Jarace would have been a contributor. I guess I land on the sense that as soon as they traded for Pascal, the season became about winning above all else. And also, so there really wasn't going to be necessarily developmental reps in the sense that Jarace needed them. And then also, I'm not sure that even if he had played those reps, that he necessarily would have been ready to be like, hey, let's see if Jarace can guard Jalen Brunson because he has a longer wingspan and a lot more length. He might get there eventually. That might somewhat be part of their answer long term because a lot of times they don't have enough size on the floor. They don't have enough rebounding on the floor. But I guess
Knicks
that's where I'm at with
Knicks
it.
Pacers 2026. Jarace is putting Brunson in hell. Maybe that'd be for like 7 possessions a game. Uh, Very interesting. I'm gonna sit here with my revisionist history because I didn't get to watch or commentate on this. I'm gonna try and think back to where I would have been. We talked about it immediately. I expressed like pessimism about Doug McDermott. Like shooting isn't just shooting.
Right.
Doug McDermott is not Buddy Hield. I expressed like this seems like I don't know if that works. The Pacers aren't reliant on just being able to like package Doug McDermott offense into an offense like some teams have been in the past, including the Pacers in the past actually, but not this Pacers team. I don't necessarily even at the time see the upside of the McDermott stuff. So I'm going to say that back then I would have been a let Jarace get some run guy because I am more often than not a like let the young kid try it out. I hope he
I think
gets
it's
more.
because the swings were so wild. I mean, I do agree with you. The types of movement threes that Doug gets are very different than the types of movement threes than Buddy gets and how he needs to be used within an offense, even just so from the direction of which he
Yep.
comes and flies off of screens and how that fits with the other players on the floor. But it
Well,
was like,
Hallie likes going right. Buddy Hield likes catching left.
right.
That's a
And
like
TJ
we don't.
McConnell as well too. TJ typically nashes to his right. You can use him at a pistol to fly off of those screens there. Buddy more so goes to the left. Almost like during the Bjorkgren season, almost 80% of the plays that Doug got coming off of screens were from the left corner. And
Yes,
that's in part why he fits so well with Sabonis because Sabonis likes to run dribble handoffs with his left hand to that corner and create space with contact. That's just the difference between shooters. I think, like you said, sometimes even just you sitting there and logging what types of threes Grady's getting, it's very easy just to look at the box score and be like, well, that's what that guy shoots on catch and shoot, or that's what that guy shoots off coming off screens. Well, what's the context within the plays and within the actions, how those guys are going to get plugged into those plays?
like why Grady is a better shooter fading left on threes. than he is fading right. But on mid-range shots, he's better fading right. And it's pretty stark. Like it's your body, the way it aligns, it creates different context for success. And yeah, as you said, like 80 Doug comes out of the left corner. That is what Doug McDermott does. The Pacers, as currently constructed, how dangerous are they coming out of the left corner? Like that's not their bag. They don't need to be doing that necessarily, and especially not just for Doug. They want to be able to build around Tyrese. And like, is Tyrese more dangerous going left or right? We all know the answer to that. His whole game is built around going right. And he has a bunch of counters to attune to that. And Buddy being like this blurred ghost going left, catching against all kinds of contests, being able to like pump, put the ball down, pump gets sideways with a pound dribble to hit another three. Like contextual stuff, the marriage of games, Jamal Murray, Jokic, Haliburton, healed. Like sometimes you find unique fits, and Doug is not healed in that regard.
I mean, I guess I could wrap up this very extended Jarace conversation by saying there were swings, like even you would have seen it when they played in Toronto, that like I had tweeted at the time, probably going to need to be Jarace time. And then 4 minutes later, I was like, the Jarace time was already too long. But then they can go to LA and he comes out after halftime and he's guarding Paul George, and just a really impressive all the way around game from him. It was everything that tantalized people about Jarace when the Pacers drafted him. So I think I would just say that people hold tight. He's only 20 years old. There's a lot to like about him. I think he's going to get a chance to show it. It just didn't work out in the way that this season played out once they traded for Obi Toppin after they drafted him. They traded for Pascal Siakam. They were exceeding expectations in the season, and what they thought it was going to be changed. And that's why before the season even started, I wrote an article called Jarace Walker is a microcosm for the Pacers. Yeah. Because if he doesn't play, it's going to be because they were winning and there wasn't necessarily going to be a place for him. If he does play, it's going to be because they needed to pivot towards development. And I think he would have gotten more of a chance to play. I think that fans are right. There's reason to quibble. Like last night when you're in garbage time, I can't say that I fully understand why Doug McDermott's being inserted into a playoff game before Jarace either. I understand your quibbles, but I also get why the coaching staff was slower with some of the things that they were doing with him throughout the year.
Rookies will not save you. However, it's good to be mindful of where you are attempting to put them on the developmental curve. Yep. And I don't know if 12 minutes instead of 9 is what saves Jarace or moves him, but part of being a basketball team for public consumption is that there are millions of people who give a shit. And it's like...
And I'm sure he does too. Like, yeah, I mean, I'm sure this is a part of it. Like, honestly, if you're Jarace sitting on the bench and you see, like, no offense, this is not me trying to put down Kendall Brown or Doug McDermott, but if you see Kendall Brown and Doug McDermott walking past you to go into a playoff game,
you're like, what the hell? Yeah, that's it seems like what Rick did there was Rick stiff-armed a very easy W. He was like, no. And I can't really see why, but fun to talk about for like 15 to 18 minutes, you know?
The people want the Jarace conversation, Samson.
I'm glad.
It's been a hot button all year. And when the Pacers lead by almost 40, there's not a lot of nitty-gritty to break down here.
Well, I'll tell you this much. I'm not afraid to disagree with you on anything. However, when I've seen so little of Jarace going back to Houston and some stuff sparingly throughout, it is nice that when you asked me about what I thought, I seemed to get his game in my initial thoughts. So thank goodness I didn't show my ass in the Jarace analysis.
I don't think you ever do with any of your analysis. Sometimes it's just us seeing things through a different lens and where you want to, what buttons you want to push. I always think that I sometimes disagree with you. I never think that what you're saying is bad or incorrect.
Do you think the league-wide podcast we do should be called like the short run, like the mix of the short roll and the rim run, the everlasting beef between us?
I thought maybe you were going to pull up that play of Pascal from Game 3 and show it to me and be like, you see, not everybody can make plays out of it.
and also when he went all the way to the rim and drew the free throws, rim running, I suppose, versus.
Yeah. Hey, a fun callback to close this out with. I don't know if you saw, but somebody left a comment on our prior podcast. I think they were a Bouncing Around fan, and they had said that they appreciated your shout out of Ready to Diagram, and that it brought back old memories for them, and that they would like there to be another crossover. So.
Oh yeah. Hell yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. That'd be good. That'd be fun.
That
It's
is how we originally met. So
3 people who are incredibly good with the whiteboard, and then me. That is what it is. Like we
and
don't.
I'll just be watching it because I'm not one of the 3 either.
Good lord.
But anyway, so
Yeah.
the Pacers even up the series. Game 5, stage is set for hopefully. I wish both teams were fully healthy. I truly do. If there's any Knicks fans watching this, I lament that you're watching your team limp to the finish in that game. I really do, because for the sake of good basketball, I would like to watch both of these teams doing this at full strength, even if only to see, like, hey, what happens if Tyrese guards OG Anunoby? Hey, what happens if OG guards Miles Turner? These are scenarios that I enjoy thinking about and watching play out in real time. So hopefully all of that can start working somewhat more in the Knicks' fortune, even, not that I'm wishing misfortune for the Pacers. I'm just rooting for basketball at this point. So we will, unless you have any closing thoughts, I shouldn't cut you off. Do you have anything else you want to add before we get out of here?
Go buy an Agrarian Buckets t-shirt.
A very popular shirt. A
Yeah.
very popular shirt.
And when you get it, take a picture in it and tag us. That's what I'd like to see.
At the arena. I always get people telling me that they're wearing the shirts at the arena. Last year, I don't know how familiar you are with the Indy 500, biggest sporting event in the world, which I've lived in Indiana my entire life, but I've never been to it. But I was told that there was like 10, 20 people walking around with Jump Pass t-shirts there. And I was like, if you're wearing one of these,
Well,
send
I
me a
brought
picture.
the Pretty Girls Can Guard 2 shirt to Scotiabank Arena for like 4 games, I think, this past, but I didn't wear it for the Pacers game. So when I had that conversation with Jenny, it maybe would have been cool to be wearing your shirt, but I didn't even think about it as far as that. But yeah.
We've made it into 4 arenas, I think. It's been at the Raptors Arena on multiple people. It's been obviously in Gamebridge. It's been at a Brooklyn Nets game on Women's Empowerment Night, and it's also been in the Spurs Arena. So we travel well. But
yeah,
that's our latest t-shirt ad at the end of a podcast. And until then, go take time, look at the t-shirt post, read it, read the article. Because I'm bad at promoting myself, read the article that I wrote about Aaron Nesmith and how the Pacers are collapsing around him. I went into more depth than what Samson and I talked about on this pod. And also, I think a lot of times people think of me as as like an oracle of technical information, but I like to think that I can write decently. I think the writing's pretty good on that article. So go check it out if you would like. Patreon.com/basketball she wrote. And I'm assuming, depending upon what Samson's schedule is, that he'll be back potentially writing something after game 5.
Yes. I'll be back for game 5. Is it bucolic or bucolic? How do you pronounce that word? I've never heard it spoken.
I say bucolic.
Bucolic? That makes sense. It like tickled my brain. I was like, ooh.
Speaking of word pronunciation, I've now mispronounced. When I was on your podcast, I was very embarrassed after the fact because the clip that you shared of it, I said Dennis Schroeder, and I took 3 years of German so that I could. I took 3 years of German so I could mispronounce a German player's name. And I've also noticed while editing this that I keep saying Isaiah Hartenstein instead of Stein, and that's upsetting for me. I don't like it when I mispronounce words and names.
I've heard it a few different ways. Stein. I thought it was Stein. Like you're supposed to put the SH there. Hartenstein. But
I keep pronouncing it like Berenstain Bears, and it's not correct. And I keep saying it that way.
Just call him Hardy. That's what people call him. I heart Hardy. People are cheating it. They're getting around it. That's what.
Again, I apologize to the Knicks fans and everybody else that I keep saying players' names wrong. I really don't like it when I do that, but I am going to stop babbling now and say,
Brunson, star guard for the New York Knicks. Yeah. All right.
See you after game 5.